regardless of what you think about Augustine, you know, a lot of what he says in here could fall into the sort of innocuous or theologically abstract category. But a lot of his thinking was used later to legitimize the Crusades, for instance. We have to bring in the kingdom. We have to make the world, our part of the world, we have to make it Christian. We have to make it the kingdom of God. And so that didn't end really well. Calvin's Geneva. I know some of you might be John Calvin fans. And not to take away from Calvin's genius, because he wrote the Institutes when he was 29 years old, didn't have things like concordances and Bible software and stuff like that. So the guy obviously has a lot going on upstairs. But the problem is, if you actually look at Calvin's Geneva, you probably wouldn't want to move there. It had the feel of an attempted utopia, a theocratic state, run, of course, by Calvin. So there would be some things there that would make us uncomfortable. If you were living in Calvin's Geneva, you had better be a Calvinist, for instance, or it just isn't going to turn out very well. One of the trajectories I want to try to chase down is this thing that I'm calling here the utopian impulse. And that's in part prompted by where we are at culturally. It's also prompted by some of the cultural and political trajectories that I see. I mean, what we think of as conspiracy, and I think a lot of it is small c conspiracy, but is not actually new. There's always been sort of this impulse to either create the perfect society or, more pertinently, force it on people. And so I see looming on the horizon a new effort at creating a wonderful, blissful, totalitarian state. And I want to sort of pursue that a little bit and talk about it. And again, for those of you here, for those of you who listen later to the presentation, I just want you to get you thinking about why it is that this always seems to rear its ugly head, and why even Christians at times are not immune from this notion that we can make things perfect, that we can just make it all right. If we did this, that, and the other thing, everything would be okay. So I want to try to think theologically about those things, and we'll see what happens. So here's our roadmap for the day. I'm going to be trying to define what I mean and then give you the elements of utopianism. And then I'll give you some examples, and then we'll move to an evaluation section. And I want to sort of strip away the mask of utopianism and then critique it a little bit, again, theologically, in light of biblical theology, and then talk about, how in the world did we get to where we're at, and sort of what we might be looking at. Again, these are going to be broad strokes in this session. In the next session, I'm going to be a little more specific as far as what I think we're going to be having to deal with as a believing community, as the real church in the future. So, first part, definition and relevance. Utopia, as you may or may not know, again, is this idea of a perfect human society. The term itself refers to an ideal place that actually doesn't exist. It's imaginary, it's conceptual. It's this grand wish, something that can't be real in the real world, but boy, we wish it was. That sort of thing. And again, the breakdown for the term utopia: no place, a good or no place. Again, you'll see it spelled either with the E or with the OU, forming the U in either case, but it actually could have either derivation depending on who's using it. And again, an imaginary world where social justice is achieved, whatever that means, and the means of guaranteeing all that are secure. That's where the control comes in. So that's what we're talking about. And as far as the impulse, what are the elements? I mean, if you are utopian in your thinking, what are you thinking? What are you, what's in the forefront of your mind? Now, these things are not all present all the time, but they're all important to different utopian systems. So as far as elements, there's typically an ecological element, and that is the idea that we ought to be existing in a harmonious relationship to nature. And the buzzword, of course, today is sustainability. But there's something to do with humanity's relationship to their environment, okay, to its environment. So something to do with nature, the world, the created order. Some would use the phrase creation, of course, and means something entirely different than what you and I would mean. But again, there's some ecological element typically. There's always an economical element that usually focuses on egalitarian thinking, egalitarian distribution, so that everyone out there is just free from need. Again, we're going to talk about how this is spun and then sort of what the reality always turns out to be. But as we go through these, I want you to be thinking, well, who in their right mind would oppose any of this? Well, in principle, sure, we'd like, we're not in favor of, hey, who all out there wants to rape the environment and pillage natural resources? I mean, nobody's going to say, yeah, let's go at that. And, we wouldn't say, well, my optimal view of things would be that lots of people don't have enough to eat, so there we go. I mean, nobody's going to say something like that. So it's easy to sort of float the idea, but then where the rubber meets the road is always, well, what exactly does that mean and how is it accomplished? Other elements, political, again, this ambition for world peace, again, who would want world war or lots of war? Freedom from crime, again, these are all desirable things. The key is going to be, though, again, how do we define what's a crime and what isn't? What's criminalized and what isn't? And then how do we bring this to pass? What are the enforcement mechanisms and who's the target? Okay. So there's this political idea, and then there's an equality idea, equal rights, multiculturalism, and of course, gender neutrality, in our day especially, is a big element of this. And again, these things are usually cast or put opposite things like racism and male domination, defined again as, something, a situation where, earlier in our history, women couldn't own property, in the 17th, 18th century, even into the 19th century, didn't have control of their children in a divorce. It was all, male favored. So all these things that we'd look at now and say, well, that really wasn't a good idea. So yeah, sign me up for that. Okay. Again, there's a way that it's marketed, but there's going to be a reality to it that doesn't quite conform to the marketing. Progress is a big element, this idea of human improvement, and that can mean improvement of life, quality of life issues, but in our day and age, it often means improvement of the organism, okay, in various ways that, again, some of which we would certainly buy into medically. But, again, as I'm going to mention in the next session, part 2, this drifts into other areas that are kind of icky, okay, kind of, things that, probably wouldn't want to go down that road because who knows where that's going to end, and how that's going to go. Science and technology, of course, are always a part of this idea of progress. Then there's a religious element, and this has historically taken 3 forms, one of 3 forms. You either have utopian communities that are anti-religious, and that is, science and nature kind of rule the day. Nature, in effect, is really the substitute divinity. Then you have omni-religious utopianism, where that's basically all religions blend into one, either the effort to create some sort of unified religion or it's in effect a free-for-all. And of course that creates the condition that if you ever raise your hand and object to anything, then you're in the way. Okay, then you're an obstacle to the utopian idea. And you have also had Christian utopias historically. And some of these, drift into, some wacky areas of theology, but others are more communal centered, and their theology is more or less what we would define as orthodox, but it really had to do with a lifestyle. So there's some variation here. Examples of these elements in practice, again, there are political utopias, where, again, has nothing to do with any sort of religious impulse. There are some Christian utopias historically, and then there are what I would term pseudo-Christian, either things that sort of pass themselves off as Christian, but are theologically aberrant. So you get all different kinds. In the ancient world, Genesis 2 describes a utopia. That would be the one I would vote for, the good one. But it's, again, an ideal state. It's the Edenic state. So that is part of biblical theology. Outside that, though, probably what scholars would point to as sort of the earliest utopian idea would be Plato's Republic. And, as we read this in the 21st century, there are things in there that would sort of make us recoil, like, well, that can't be a good idea. But for Plato's day, it was really revolutionary, the ideas that he communicated in here about an ideal society. Augustine with the City of God. Again, Augustine's trying to argue that the world state is not the primary ideal, but again, this city of God as he defined it, Christian community, ruled by God, so on and so forth. And regardless of what you think about Augustine, a lot of what he says in here could fall into the sort of innocuous or theologically abstract category. But a lot of his thinking was used later to legitimize the Crusades, for instance. We have to bring in the kingdom. We have to make the world, our part of the world, we have to make it Christian. We have to make it the kingdom of God. And so that didn't end really well. So it's an example, again, of, we realize that the papacy, of course, is motivating a lot of the Crusades, and it was largely political. But again, it was sort of baptized, using the ideas of Augustine and others. And it just went off in a misguided direction. And I would say in many ways it was misguided from the beginning. 16th century, Calvin's Geneva. I know some of you might be John Calvin fans. And not to take away from Calvin's genius, because he wrote the Institutes when he was 29 years old, didn't have things like concordances and Bible software and stuff like that. So the guy obviously has a lot going on upstairs. But the problem is, if you actually look at Calvin's Geneva, you probably wouldn't want to move there. I mean, he's throwing people in jail for referring to him as Mr. instead of Master. Someone smiles at a baptism, and so that's prison time. And there are all sorts of things that if you read through to the history of Calvin's Geneva, it had the feel of an attempted utopia, a theocratic state, run, of course, by Calvin. So, there would be some things there that would make us uncomfortable. If you were living in Calvin's Geneva, you had better be a Calvinist, for instance, or it just isn't going to turn out very well. Thomas More, Utopia. This is where the term really entered the regular discourse with More's book. More again is casting this imaginary idea, in part as a critique, for what he saw politically going on around him. But all of these literary attempts, I think are worth reading, because on the one hand, they show you what the person's thinking, and boy, wouldn't that be wonderful? And then you turn the page and you get into enforcement. All of them require power. They require power structures to make this work. Because guess what? People are not robots. And no matter how good you make it sound, at some point there's going to be dissent. So what do you do with dissent? Well, we can't have dissent because this is utopia. We have to eliminate that. 17th century, we get Thomas Hobbes with his famous book Leviathan. Again, and this is the book that really focuses on the empowerment, the power situation of the state over people, again, to enforce this sort of perceived ideal community. Francis Bacon, The New Atlantis, is really an important book. This one has a significant influence in the United States and America. because, again, there were many, and it wasn't, you didn't have to be sort of a dyed-in-the-wool Freemason to think this way, but there were many, who would have been outside Freemasonry and just sort of in the Enlightenment discourse that would have looked at America as the new Atlantis. Again, this is the new utopia. We come here to get away from monarchy, to get away from the social ills that we see in Europe, and we get to basically start over, and we get to reimagine what communal life should be, what the ideal state would be. And, when Bacon writes New Atlantis about this imaginary place somewhere else, outside of Europe, that people go to and really start this thing called civilization over again. When people, when America's discovered, of course, by Bacon's time it was known, but when people start to migrate in serious numbers to North America, this is what they're thinking. This is the new Atlantis. This is the great country, the wonderful, country where we get to actually conduct these experiments, in reimagining what life should be like, what the state should be like. 18th century, the Shakers. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Pennsylvania originally and grew up near the Shaker area, the Shaker community, and the Ephrata cloister. In fact, my first daughter was born in Ephrata, not at the cloister. But the Shakers were a Christian community. So was the Ephrata cloister. But again, Christian. Again, there would be some things going on there that you would sort of would raise an eyebrow, or you might not recognize as Christian. But again, ostensibly, they were not atheists. Certainly, they were not secularists. They're trying to do Christian things. They tend to be very strict in terms of celibacy. I don't think there are any Shakers left anymore. Again, celibacy was part of the problem there. I think the last Shaker died like in the 1990s or something like that. I mean, you can still go see the community, and then of course the cloister. The cloister has more connections with transcendentalism and some of the quasi or overtly kinds of occult things later on in its history. But again, it's not exactly where it began. So you have, again, these sorts of early attempts at, let's go over, we create our own community, we share our own goods in common, we have our own rules for the community, that sort of thing. We separate ourselves, we isolate ourselves from the mainstream way of doing things. The Enlightenment contributes a lot to, again, the utopian thinking. The Enlightenment, of course, terribly important. Again, the age and elevation of reason, human reason. Well, if you're in Europe and, again, you've been living with centuries of monarchy and you don't like aristocracy and you see all the abuses there, the real, strict division of classes and economic states, and you think, boy, we ought to be able to do this better. That we ought to be able to think for ourselves, and we ought to have checks and balances in our government. We ought to have power divided among many, and all these political ideas we're familiar with that actually are sort of launched in the Enlightenment. Well, they launch movements. Of course, we have the American Revolution, which I have listed second here, but chronologically it preceded the French Revolution. The American Revolution was, a violent revolution, but as far as the transition of power and the establishment of power within the community, we had, peaceful transitions, from presidency to presidency and so on and so forth. This is why after Washington left office, people were really nervous. But is this actually going to work? It was a big deal that he stepped down after 2 terms. That established the 2-term tradition. It was not written into the Constitution initially. That had to come with an amendment, but when you had the transition to a new leader and the election was really close, like a couple electoral votes, is this going to erupt into chaos and that sort of thing? And it didn't. Now, the French Revolution is quite a different story. What's going on over there? It was on the one hand, we had a guy like Thomas Jefferson over here who was a Francophile. Everybody knows that. And he was on he thought the revolution was great. in France until, this isn't like the internet where you get instant information about what's really going on over there. So gradually he starts hearing about, children being guillotined and stuff like this, and Robespierre and all this. And he's like, well, boy, that's just not really a good thing. I mean, so eventually, it becomes distasteful even to somebody like Jefferson, who was like all things France. But again, both of these things, even though they sort of worked differently and took divergent paths, were fueled by the Enlightenment ideas, again, of building the ideal, the ideal state where everything's fair, everybody has enough, that sort of thing. 19th century, again, we get Second Great Awakening. I think actually this contributes to utopianism as well because of the rise of post-millennial thinking. And that is, we need to bring in the kingdom so that Jesus can come back. That's what post-millennialism is. Now, post-millennialism in the 19th century was a big deal because, again, we have this, it's hand in glove, or it works in tandem with populism. Because of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century and the way that industrial revolutions typically work is that wealth, and of course with it power and political influence, comes into the hands of a few, again in the merchant class. I'm thinking of people like J.P. Morgan, Kay Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. This is the era for that. And again, I'm not saying that everything these guys did was bad, because it wasn't. A guy like Carnegie, felt that it was just immoral to pass on your wealth. So that's why he decided to give it all away. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Not everybody felt the same way as Carnegie. Carnegie, of course, wasn't perfect himself. He had the problem with Homestead and all that. But because wealth is so highly concentrated in the hands of a few, and you get this real disparity between the wealthy elite and then the worker, okay, that creates problems across the board economically for most of the population. So it's a serious thing. And one of those that really suffered were the farmers, because people were moving from the rural parts of the country into the cities because of urbanization. Again, everything's becoming mechanized. You get factories, the whole factory system, the assembly line idea. The demographics in the country are changing dramatically. And the farmers are hurt by that. And they're also hurt by the fact that the money supply is controlled by a very few people. So to get low, there are instances in the 19th century where you can read that lenders were charging 300% on a bank loan, stuff like that. And farmers need capital to buy land, they need to buy machinery, so they're just getting killed. That all factors into the rise of the populist movement, which is a grassroots movement where, again, we, as farmers unite, we united labor, the farm industry, but then that becomes an appeal because right down here you have transcendentalism going on at the same time. This sort of utopian idea of wonderful, harmonious coexistence with the land, again, with nature. And so you have in populism, again, these sort of murky ideas of the rise of the masses to create this wonderful, harmonious, state. We want equality. We don't want this distinct classes and social classes and economic classes. And again, we're the farmers. We're the ones that are close to the land. We get our hands dirty, and we ought to be, doing sustainable. All this rhetoric was in place in the 19th century, and so that gets married to this idea of, hey, if we can pull this off, then Jesus can come back, or Jesus will come back. You had postmillennialism as an eschatological system develop during this time. And it actually led to very utopian thinking within the church. William Jennings Bryan is probably the best example. Ran for president, I don't know how many times. He never won. Obviously, probably more famous for the Scopes trial later on. But again, he was a significant figure in this whole era. Charles Finney, okay, again, post-millennial thinking. It was a big deal. Transcendentalism I've mentioned, again, Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau, the Alcotts, Walt Whitman, all these people. This was a more, and I'll use the term pagan approach. And what I mean by pagan is, paganism is at heart is about worship of the earth. You know, it's about this swap out for a personal transcendent deity. We're going to do away with that, and we're going to view nature as our divinity, as our divine focus. It's very monistic. I'll be talking about monism a lot later this afternoon in part 2. The idea that everything is one. You know, nature is God, God is nature, everything that is unified, all this. It's the Oprah theology, you know, of today. So, I mean, all of this talk that we associate with the New Age movement and Oprah and all that sort of thing is transcendentalism, you know, plus a few other threads too. You know, it's nothing new. But there were 3 communities that were deliberately started in this country that were transcendental utopian communities. Again, it was all about harmony with nature and the ecosystems and all that stuff. Marxism, of course, 19th century, an economic theory, again, really aimed at, you know, quote unquote, leveling the playing field economically and getting rid of all these, you know, class divisions and class warfare to start revolutions, to bring in what? A better society, a more, you know, egalitarian, equal society. It's an inherently utopian idea. You know, again, an economic theory that, of course, takes different forms politically. Edward Bellamy, he was a novelist looking backward. It's just a famous work describing a utopian community that looks a lot like, you know, he imagined himself to be in the year, I think it was 2000. And he's writing in the 19th century. And so, again, he's creating this vision for this ideal community, some of it would look, you know, oddly like what we're looking at right now. Again, with some of the control mechanisms and the way things are. But it was a very influential book at the time. 20th century, we get progressivism. We've all heard a lot about that recently. Again, the idea of human progress, all these utopian ideas, it's the same old stuff. Of course, with progressivism and H.G. Wells, with his works, Modern Utopia, Men Like Gods, The Shape of Things to Come, again, utopian ideas. And progressivism and H.G. Wells, of course, a lot of their thinking was influenced by eugenics. Okay, again, to create the ideal society, you need ideal people, right? You know, you need to sort of weed out the unfortunate or less desirable elements to the human population. So that was very common in the United States. A lot of later Nazi eugenic theory and practice was drawn from American and British writing, and those were the seed beds to some of those things that would come later on. Marxist Leninism, of course, this would be the Lenin experiment with Marxism. Of course, the revolution of 1917. You know, again, the working class. We're going to create the community where the worker is in power. You know, I mean, we know how that worked. But again, ostensibly, this is how it's marketed. This is how it's put forth. Huxley's Brave New World was a critique, and some would say a parody of H.G. Wells's utopian visions, because if you've ever read Brave New World, it's sort of the world without pain, really the world without any sort of trouble. It's a utopian vision, but because of some of the stuff in there, you know, what you need to do with people and to people to accomplish this, it's very dystopian. It's very, you know, scary. I don't know if you've ever read Brave New World, but I do recommend it. National Socialism, again, Nazism, again, used a lot of utopian thinking, the utopian techniques, you know, utopian goals. They tied race to it, you know, specifically in certain ways. There were certain occult threads that drove their view of the different races. Again, all of these things have more than one thread, but they're all attempts at creating the perfect state. And of course, the perfect state is always in the mind and the eye of the power holder, okay? The one who gets to define all that. Communism, another example. George Orwell, Again, Animal Farm and 1984 are obviously critiques of this. 1984, one of the scarier books I've ever read. If you've not read 1984, well, I was going to say I recommend it, but in this day and age, maybe not. It might put you out on the ledge. Somebody'd have to talk you off the ledge, because a lot of 1984, you could see, man, you could just implement this really with a snap of your fingers today. But 1984 is really, frightening. And Animal Farm is in its own way as well. Again, I recommend both of those. Atlas Shrugged is also a utopian element, even though that's popular with a lot of conservatives. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, and I enjoyed the novel, but I recognize that the author is an atheist, and a lot of her, Ayn Rand's, thinking is certainly contrary to good theology. It's an entertaining read, even though it's 1,000 pages long. It's very clever. But Galt's Gulch is a perfectly utopian community. Okay? If you've ever read the book, you know that. Hippie movement, the 1960s, again, bringing in the age of Aquarius, where everybody's equal and there's no war and all this stuff. Again, the themes are familiar. Of course, the American left as we know it grew out of that.